Hi everyone, it's Peter, and now I just want to follow up a second quick 15-minute talk on basically the theme again of intersection of Christianity and medieval culture. We left off last time talking just a little bit about the arrival of the mendicant orders, so thinking primarily of the Franciscans and the achievements of St. Francis, in essence, setting up a religious order that focused on poverty and focused on tending to the needs of the urban poor. This is a new populace that's beginning to emerge, particularly with the rise of new forms of economic activity that will ultimately come to fruition as capitalism. The One of the most interesting cultural byproducts of the mendicants, besides the numerous stories told about their lives, and we're looking at a fresco that was painted in Assisi in the Basilica. There are actually two basilicas, kind of one atop each other in Assisi. This is from the upper church in San Francesco in Assisi. This is a good example. The basilica, a good example of architecture, and the fresco within it, a good example of the artistic activity that came hot on the heels, so to speak, of the rise of the mendicant orders. Because those churches required public participation and support, they became a great source of, I guess, a place of focus for telling the stories of their various founding saints, and to build and enhance that legend is to build and enhance public awareness and public support. So we see in the decades following, say, St. Francis's death, 1226, a rise in all kinds of artistic projects. And in the Italian peninsula, in the areas of Tuscany and Umbria in particular, the rise of fresco painting as a point of as a method, in essence, of telling these stories. So here we see Francis preaching to the birds in the village of Bivagna, one of the popular narratives that emphasizes Francis's intersection, or I should say appreciation, with nature and natural phenomena. That's certainly brought out in the Canticle of Brother Sun, where he praises the moon and the stars and the wind and water and things like this. A new awareness of or interest in the phenomena of everyday life is certainly a phenomenon, a cultural phenomenon of this time. If we looked at that idea of Francis or Dominic, or even to some degree the heretics that I mentioned in the previous video, that sense of wanting to move outside typical channels of worship or theology is pretty strong, and that tendency in religion is often described using the term mysticism. Mysticism, in essence, is the idea of a kind of direct perception or awareness, knowledge of God outside the typically accepted channels of the church. We have to remember that sense of social and political and economic control that the church is trying to enhance with the sacraments and many other things besides. Mysticism, in essence, sidetracks, goes around that, and it's sometimes seen as an enhancement of the church's message, and in other situations seen as a very potentially dangerous thing indeed. A good example of the way in which that way of thinking or believing could be seen as dangerous is the degree to which it comes from, mysticism comes from women. And the place of women in the religious culture of the Middle Ages is a fascinating story on multiple levels. St. Francis, for instance, had a follower, St. Clare, who establishes her own order in Assisi. And Hildegard of Bingen, moving further north, is a very interesting, very powerful and active woman who preserves for us her mystical visions in a series of writings that are still very much available today. And so she also not only wrote, but illustrated her visions. And that's what we see in the illustration now. Um, the sort of vision of what's described in her scivias, I guess it's a kind of combination of the word skito, vias domini, know the ways of the Lord, where she hears this voice of the Lord coming down, and it's visualized in striking artistic terms, coming down this mountain, this very vivid, a sort of huge mountain having the color of iron. So these authors, and I think it's fascinating. We get a sort of direct reflection of them as people, not just monks or saints, or in the case of Hildegard, abbesses, that is to say, church officials, but also people themselves. They're sorts of individual feelings, emotions, even passions are striking, and must have caught the eye and attention of many people in their own time, even as printing hadn't been invented. These manuscripts are being looked at, read, admired widely. And the church has an interesting conundrum in terms of dealing with them, how far they should be allowed to go forward. More typical of official church literature would be sermon literature, literature that is intended to be maybe not strictly speaking read out loud, but certainly serving as a model or example for others to consider when preaching to the faithful. Again, that's kind of a newer thing as we come into the 13th century. That sense of interaction, especially in the urban setting, is more and more important. So the need for effective and vivid church oratory is important. It's a theme we'll run into later in the culture of Western Europe, especially in the 17th century and late 16th century in the Baroque. So Innocent III is quite a powerful character in papal history, delivered or prepared a description of how terrible it is to be a human being, and particularly emphasizing, and this what's known as a transy, a kind of depiction of a decaying body, very nicely illustrates this. The physical aspects of corruption and putrefaction, and the sense that in this life the human condition is not very good, and that in the next, if we don't care for our souls, that we will find an even more horrific fate waiting for us in death, with describing, translated into English here, Innocent would have been writing in Latin, weeping and gnashing of teeth, groaning and wailing, fear and trembling, darkness and anguish, etc., etc. And this is the kind of language brought into popular culture in lots and lots of different ways in, for example, the visual arts, the kind of understanding of how things were for people that certainly would have found a ready audience, if for nothing else than that vivid description of pain and misery. In the play Everyman, we see a development of a possible way out of the misery of the human condition. The sense, and this is important in medieval theology, that good works, that doing the right thing, that leading a moral life, and the idea of a morality play certainly plays into this, so to speak, will offer you, especially with the mediation of the church, a way to heaven. This is quite a powerful concept and preserved nicely in the play Everyman, where a dying person, a dying man, is basically confronted with his fate and tries to find some sort of refuge, in essence, from death, from destruction and in a sense from hell, and is invited in essence to find out what actually endures in the face of death. And as his as a sort of journey, and there's very much a kind of allegorical journey through all the things that he has, whether it's worldly possessions or any of the rest of it that are ultimately going to fail him in the end. Ultimately, it's only going to be good deeds that stands by him and ultimately redeems him. And indeed, at the end of the play, into thy hands, Lord, my soul I commend, receive it, Lord, that it not be lost. So that good deeds, and especially in conjunction with the church's agency, are what ultimately save us from a fate of hell and damnation, as described by Innocent III. Now, the simplistic, formulaic kind of depiction of the dilemmas and conflicts and choices faced by souls, as it were, in the Christian worldview, is ultimately not particularly, I think, satisfying. A writer does come along in the later decades of the 13th century into the beginning of the 14th century, whose writing winds up being particularly influential on later writers and indeed potentially on Western culture in general. That writer is Dante Alighieri. Dante is originally from Florence and is a real champion of the form of Italian that would be described as Tuscan. The great contribution in many ways of Dante, besides his very famous poem known as Commedia, the comedy or divine comedy, is indeed elevating the role of Italian as a language worthy of a high-level artistic expression. So he and another writer from roughly the same time, Boccaccio, compose very important works that certainly drew a great deal of attention and respect in a very vigorous and direct native tongue. Dante's poem, the Commedia, is vast in terms of the potential directions for discussion. And I'm only going to skim just a few aspects of the poem, but it in essence provides a much more penetrating and complex description of that soul in peril, much more so than the Everyman play. In Everyman, a generic character is faced with a generic situation, confronted with generic representations of, again, things like worldly possessions or fellowship or death, these kinds of things. Dante, on the other hand, is an actual person. Dante, indeed, if we study a little bit of the life story of Dante, Dante finds himself in a genuine, profound spiritual crisis. He is quite literally, as he describes it, lost in a dark wood where he's lost the correct path, the straight way. It's described, it's not the worst translation, although trying to get his terzo rima, this interlocking rhyme scheme that Dante uses in English, can be a little tricky. But midway in our life's journey, I went astray. In essence, he loses the right road, the straight road. And the path to salvation is by no means clear. And that, in essence, occupies the remainder of the poem as he makes his way down through the depths of Inferno, encountering many contemporary figures, people he would have known, people his readers certainly would have known, makes his way all the way down through these different levels of basically hell, eventually coming out onto the mountain of purgatory, and then finally out into the Empyrean and his blissful vision of God, summing up for many that worldview of the medieval period, just as it's about to disappear for all time in the aftermath of the Black Death.